And now for Talk Media News. Made possible by our sponsor, Beth Ernest and Associates Real Estate. Beth Ernest's team of real estate brokers have been serving the Portland area for over 22 years, specializing in residential real estate, lots, and land. More at bethernest.com. We are pleased to welcome Tom Squitieri from Talk Media News, talkmedianews.com. Good morning, Tom. What do you have for us today?
Good morning. Happy Friday.
Thank you. Happy Friday to you as well. Happy almost weekend.
That's right. Happy almost weekend. Well, it's a strange day in Washington, D.C. this morning.
When is it
There
not?
actually may be a bipartisan compromise on something.
Whoa!
On what?
Mark it on your
I
calendars.
thought you guys would get a chuckle out of that. The House and Senate negotiators have been meeting behind closed doors, as the cliche goes, to hammer out a funding proposal for the government so it avoids another shutdown. And part of that, of course, is money for border security.
Oh, yes.
Here's what's been incredible about that so far. Not one major leak has come from those negotiations, which is almost unheard of in Washington. And yesterday, Senator Shelby of Alabama, he's the Republican chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, went to the White House to brief President Trump on what the negotiators were saying, and apparently the president was good with what he heard so far. So that may mean that there'll be an agreement announced today and give the House and the Senate a week to approve the legislation and send it to President Trump for signature, because a week from today is when the money runs out.
Amazing. So does that mean we're
that
possibly...
would be interesting, different in how things have been going the last 2 years.
That's very true. I wonder what's changed. Does that mean that we're possibly circumventing this whole national emergency issue?
I would not go that far.
Wishful
say
thinking.
that because, as we all know, and this is I would say a unfair, honest look at President Trump. He changes his mind quite often on things, and he has kept that national emergency threat hovering like a sword of Damocles over Congress. He may not like the amount of money is included in this compromise for, here's the word I've come up with, structure, for any structures on the border. I don't want to say wall or barrier because these terms have gotten political.
Right.
So there'll probably be some money for a structure, for structures in this compromise. He may not think it's sufficient this time, and thus he may not approve the legislation that gets approved by Congress, and or he may approve it and say we still need more money and declare a national emergency. Now, yesterday, this is Friday, so yesterday I asked the guy in the Pentagon press office who does budgets, has the Department of Defense looked to see where the money would come from, and he couldn't tell me because that comes from the different services, but he assured me that since President Trump first raised the idea of declaring a national emergency, the military has been looking at what money they might have to give up for construction projects. So, they're aware that this might still happen, and they're hoping it doesn't, like everybody else in the government, but it still may. That was a long answer to your question, but I wanted to be thorough.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. It's where the details are what's really important.
Yeah.
So what else is going on in Washington today?
Let me see. Well, this week was supposed to be the week that Pentagon, and I cover the Pentagon, so a lot of my stuff focused on that.
Great.
But the Pentagon budget was supposed to be released this week. It was not because of the government shutdown. However, they had already scheduled this week a bunch of hearings by the House and Senate Armed Services Committee with the different top military folks. And that's been great. Here's why. Because they didn't have the budget to talk about, so they're actually talking about other important areas, such as Syria, Venezuela, etc. And it's been a wealth of wonderful information, both for immediate stories and sort of nuggets of information that drive future stories. For example, yesterday, the head of Southern Command, that's the part of the Defense Department that takes care of Central and South America, that's their geographic jurisdiction, said that the president of Venezuela, Maduro, has surrounded himself with Cuban bodyguards. Cubans have supplied military aid to Venezuela.
Interesting.
Cuban bodyguards, because he's concerned at some point that his own military will turn against him. Now, see, that's the kind of a nugget of information that's, wow, really?
Yeah.
And that kind of shows you the scope of how intelligence can be a deep dive on occasion. So he has the Cubans surrounding him because the bulk of the Venezuelan military, which is still loyal to Maduro, they're starving as well, like the rest of the population. So yesterday, U.S. aid and other aid arrived in Colombia. It's sitting on the border of Venezuela as a bridge crossing. And I haven't been down there, so I'm just going from the news reports. And the Venezuelan military blocked that bridge so the aid couldn't come into the country. Excuse me. So here you are. You're a soldier starving, okay? And you see this aid across the bridge in Colombia. And at some point, soldiers are going to say, hey, what's the deal here? You know, we need to eat. So the fact that Maduro has Cuban soldiers around him is one of those indications that, aha, this is what's happening in Venezuela. We wouldn't have heard that probably had the budget been sent to the Hill, because the whole discussions would have been about, you need X amount of dollars for this aircraft carrier.
That's a very good point.
And so this week has been really good. That's just one example. I loved it because I'm a nerd. I like details. And I heard all about how China is operating in Africa, and how the training is going in Afghanistan. All these things that we don't get an opportunity to hear in public. And then, interesting also is that all these folks, these top brass, then went into closed door sessions with the committees to deal with more detail. So it was a good week in a sense of a learning of things on the Pentagon footprint around the world.
Yeah.
You guys still with me, or I lose you?
Yes, no. We're here. Sorry, we're just absorbing. This is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, these are great things because it's often very difficult to get this kind of information from the top people because they're so, they're so isolated from us with layers of bureaucracy.
I can imagine. But thank you for being there and doing the investigating.
So is there any sort of predictions or timelines for when the military in Venezuela might make the move and switch to
No, he was
support
asked that.
Guerrero?
Now, he may have addressed that in the private session. Obviously, I wasn't there. But I have to look at this with somewhat of a satisfied smile in that if you can wait out the situation as opposed to send in troops, which would be a disaster, you can wait out the situation and let the Venezuelans take care of it themselves. I may have mentioned on your show last week, Mexico has still supported and technically Maduro. And what that does is it gives the Mexicans the diplomatic opportunity to create an exit plan for Maduro if the situation has him calling for him to step down and leave the country.
Oh, interesting.
That's a key. You need to have that exit door available so it's not a bloody fight necessarily to get him out of office. And, the Mexicans can accommodate this, perhaps with a wink and a nod from the rest of the country, like the United States and other countries. That avoids a bloody showdown, and it makes it better for the people of Venezuela, obviously, to have some kind of peaceful transition to a system that seems to be more democratic. I'm not characterizing what's going on in Venezuela as a democratic system or not. I'm just trying to provide, an analysis of how an end game could happen in the most bloodless, peaceful way without shooting.
Right. And this is interesting. I didn't realize that there were so many Latin American countries that were players in this whole drama.
Yeah, I think that it's Mexico, and I'm blanking out on the second country, one of the South American countries. It could be in not Chile, but Ecuador perhaps. And I know the difference between the countries. I just can't remember which one it was with Mexico that also recognized Maduro. So I think there are those options. And that's important because a military solution is not going to work. You're going to go in there and take them out, and it's Yankee imperialism again, and there's no need for it. The Venezuelans are unhappy with the government. You have a opposition leader. You have a lot of the world supporting this person. You have aid going there. You have medical help. The United States has provided medical help in the form of the USS Comfort medical ship to refugees. So it's not like this is a U.S. versus Venezuela situation. It's a lot of the world is supporting a democratic transition there.
Which is, I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, and it's rare, right?
And it's just not to say that it hasn't already been bloody or violent within Venezuela already, but
Sure,
just
Correct.
what
Correct.
can the international community do to kind
Correct.
of cap or not at least increase that?
So those are the two things that I'm watching, and I'm watching Syria, of course, and see what happens there. and Afghanistan, which, we could talk about next week maybe. There might be some more progress on that.
Sure, absolutely. I know it's we'll have to keep an eye on it because there are just so many things going on in the world. It's hard to cover them all.
And Tom, if you ever get any access to information about Area 51, we'll also be very
Would you
interested
repeat that, please?
Just making.
She's asking you about aliens.
I've never had an inside person at the Pentagon.
Oh, I see your point. That was a hard left turn, but I'm glad you asked it because I think it's what we were all thinking.
I actually didn't hear your question. I'm serious. I wasn't making a joke.
Oh, I was. I was saying if you have any information on Area 51, next week or days to come.
I'll be happy to.
Keep your ear out for us.
I'll send you guys a photograph of one of the doors in Navy intelligence, which is about, they have "Welcome to Area 51" on it.
Oh, yeah. Tweet us. We want to see that.
So glad you asked.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Tom Squitieri,
all right, great.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Tom Squitieri.
Oh, you're very welcome. Have a great weekend.
You as
Bye-bye.
well. Talk Media News segment was brought to you by Beth Ernest and Associates Real Estate. Lots of land at bethernest.com. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with more news. Stick around. Radio is yours.